Hi, I'm Duncan from Fishhead, and today we're talking about PE 2 to 4 rods. The range of rods that we have here is an extremely versatile bunch of rods. They're very popular because they represent, usually for a lot of people doing inshore and close-in fishing, these are often the heaviest rods you might use. And likewise, when you go for offshore fishing, these become your light tackle rod, so the lightest rod that goes in the boat. So for many people, this is a range that's really important because they take this rod everywhere, whether you're fishing inshore or offshore. The rods also are designed to be versatile to work a wide variety of lures. So they're not super long rods, and yeah, at most of these around 7'3" to 7'8", so a mid-range of rods, which allows you plenty of ease for manipulating lures, but without sacrificing too much in the casting distance. They're ideal for smaller kingfish and snapper on soft plastics and vibration baits, that sort of thing. All the small pelagics like tailor and salmon, bonitos, and then through to more northern areas where you might use them for coral flats fishing, for trout and emperors, for inshore chasing queenfish, going offshore chasing mahi-mahi, and yeah, a whole lot of stuff in between. And one really popular use for these is chasing long-tailed tunas. So they're major species for people who chase sport fish throughout Queensland and other northern parts of Australia. And these are definitely a popular range of rod for that style of fishing. In terms of the lures that we tested in this range, we went from some smaller stick baits down around the 25 gram mark through to larger poppers at 65 grams. Try and get a broad range of what is commonly used in this sort of fishery. The lighter end was the CB1 Ozma, a little sinking stick bait. Nice little white bait imitation. Then we moved on to the FCL Labo CSP S110S, which is pretty popular whether you go north or south for chasing all kinds of pelagics. Then to test the heavy end, we went to the 65 gram FCL Labo CC Pop, which has got quite a large cup face for the size of lure, so that gave us a good indication of how the rods were able to pull those more bulky lures through the water. We also we started off with a slightly smaller range of rods, and then we decided that we should probably toss in a couple of the lighter rods that do kind of just fit into this category. So they only cast up to about 45 grams, ideally on those lighter rods. So we slipped in a Labana milkshake diving popper as well to test the upper end of those rods. When we're out casting the lures, the things that we look for are, for one, can the rod cast the lure effectively? So can it get it out a good distance and also accurately? And then how does it manipulate that lure? So for the lighter end of the range, usually it's not a problem. For the softer rods, they can swim all kinds of lures. But as you get to the top end of the range, it becomes harder and harder for the softer tipped rods to be able to cope with the getting a good manipulation of some of the big lures. So if you just want to crank a lure, then what the rod can do is not so important. But if you want to be able to twitch and do more technical actions on your lures, then how the rod flexes and what it can do with those heavier lures starts to become a lot more important. Also, we did some lifting tests on the rod. We do those, lifting weights straight up and down off the floor. So that's a good indication of seeing how the rod is going to load from tip to butt, and gives us a bit of a feel of where the top end of what the rod can handle is, but also by no means absolutes on how the rods can be fished. Especially with these lighter rods, a lot of people will fish them at very low rod angles, so with the rod flattened right out so the tip is not doing too much work, and that enables you to fish a lot heavier than what you would fish if you're going through a more 90-degree bend with the rod. But it's nice to know how they load at that 90-degree angle, or with the rod at 45 degrees and weight straight down, so even more extreme angles, because it just gives you a good feel of how it's going to work when you have a big fish sitting at the side of the boat. Okay, To start off with today, we've got the Zenaq Fokeeto 761 Longcast. So this rod has a nice softer tip here, not a super fast taper. That flex goes down to about a third of the way down initially, but definitely has that very soft action at the tip end. Stiffens up a bit through this middle section and then ramps up quite a bit when you get into the butt there. It's got a nice stiff bottom end. The rod specs, we've got top of the line Fuji reel seats, really nice tapered grips, titanium frame silicon guides all the way through, and we have a couple of double footers and then single footers going up to the tip there. So single footers give us a little bit lighter weight at the tip, gives it a bit more sensitivity, but also when you're running really heavy leaders, the knots tend to rattle around a lot more in the single foot guides. But for keeping things light, that's ideal. For the reel on this one, we went with the 4000 size Saltiga. Compared to some of the other heavier rods on test, this one just balanced much better with the lighter reel. It's rated as a P1 to 2.5 rod, and we think P2 and that 4000 size reel is just a perfect match for it. It works really, really well. Cast weights, it goes from 8 to 45 grams. So we were casting lures from around that 25 gram mark and up, especially, because that's a lot of what the little small pelagic lures that we tend to use. Certainly this rod will handle down to that 12, 14 gram lure, no trouble at all, and will give you nice manipulation and good twitching action on those smaller lures. Once you get up to the 25 grams, it's right in its happy place for casting really long distances and doing it very accurately. It gives you a nice feel. You can manipulate those stick baits really well. When you get to the 40 gram CSP, it casts it really nicely. It does start to get a little bit more tip wobble at that stage when you're belting out the long casts. That softer tip starts to fold on you a lot more, and that can lead to slightly less accurate casting. So as you get to that top end, the tip doesn't work for you quite so nicely, but it still manages to sweep the stick bait through the water well. But the 40 gram Labana milkshake diving popper, it cast it fine at 40 grams. For sweeping it, you could get a nice bloop and having it pull through the water very well. However, it didn't do so much of the technical manipulations because the tip starts to fold away on you. So certainly at the lighter end of its range, it performs extremely well. Once you get to the higher end, it casts the lures and gets the lures there, but it doesn't allow you to do as much manipulation with it. Moving on to the lifting. Initially, as you load, you can see the long soft tip of the rod folds away very quickly. And then as it loads, that tip section is folded away completely, bringing the weight back closer to the body and down around that first guide through to the foregrip, all the weight's loading up there. So makes for a comfortable lifting rod, and it's quite a taper step up between the soft tip and the powerful bottom end. So for a quick summary of this rod, we've got a nice soft tip section, a gently progressive middle section that then ramps up into a stiff fish fighting butt. So definitely for pelagics and reef fish where you want a lot more finesse at the tip end, this rod is a great rod, very easy to use and nice and light. Next rod we have on test is the Ocean Devil Kingslayer. This rod starts out quite soft at the tip, so it's got that softer, more slightly faster taper initially at the tip, but then it becomes a fairly moderate, like there's not a huge stiffening up as you get into the middle there. It stays quite supple and then just slowly, steadily becomes stiffer and stiffer until you get right down towards the grips, and then you get a nice stiff bottom end here around the foregrip. For the reel on this rod, we went with the 4000 size Saltiga. Again, being such a light rod, it was a perfect match for it. So it is rated to work P1.5 to 3. But again, like the little Zenaq, we think that 4000 reel PE2 is a really nice match for this rod. Fitting wise, nice Fuji reel seat. We have stainless framed silicon guides, so one step down compared to the other rods on test. And then one double foot guide, then single footers all the way to the tip. So slightly smaller sized single footers than some of the other rods we're looking at, but that keeps things nice and light and finessey at the tip end. But you may find when you're running bigger leaders, they start to hang up a bit more in these guides. Casting wise, this rod's rated to cast up to 60 grams. We gave it a good go with the 25 gram CB1. It cast it really well, just super easy. It loads smoothly down the rod and just casts like a rocket. It definitely would also cast down to that 10, 12, 15 gram mark. It'll handle that with no dramas. So much lighter in the tip than some of the other rods on test. So definitely works well at that lighter end. With the 25 gram lure, you could certainly feel everything through the rod. You could twitch, you can do whatever you like, and it did it very nicely. Once we moved up to the 40 gram CSP, then it was pretty well saturating the rod when you cast it. So it still cast really nicely, but it starts to get that feel like the other lighter Zenaq. When you really try to belt out the 40 gram lures, you start to get a bit more tip wobble. And so when you cast really nicely, you get a nice accurate cast, but if you don't quite hit it right, the lighter rods tend to be less accurate as you get into those heavier weights. So the lure does tend to just veer off a little bit left or right because you can feel the tip not quite giving you that authority through it. But having said that, it gets the lure out there, no trouble at all. So working those 45 gram lures, as you would expect, it pulls them through the water okay, but with this nice soft sort of feeling to it, doesn't give you much of the technical action. But what you lose at the top end, you'll definitely gain at the lighter end. Okay, moving on to the lifting test here with the Kingslayer. Again, we've got a nice soft tip section that folds away very quickly and then comes down into a more powerful bottom end. And this one you can definitely see stiffens up a lot from the stripper guide, and we've got a nice stiff section coming through to the foregrip. So overall on this rod, what we have is a finesse tip and a moderate taper through the rod with power right down here in the butt. So definitely, if you're wanting to finesse some of the bigger fish, this is a great rod for the job. All right, next up in our test, we have the Zenaq 782 Longcast. So this is the bigger brother to the 761. Straight away you notice it has a much stiffer tip. So with the 761, it was very soft, but this one steps it up considerably, and it has more of a step to the taper. So it has this section here, which loads down to about that third there. Then you notice there's quite an obvious step up in stiffness through the middle and then into a more powerful butt. So fittings wise, like the other Zenaq, we've got top of the line Fuji's titanium silicon guides, and we've got double footers and then stepping down to the single footers towards the tip to keep the tip feeling nice and light. Line ratings on this one, PE2 to 3. I think, PE2 and 2.5. 2.5 is probably a really happy place for it personally, but you certainly can put the PE3 on there as well if you wish. It's rated to cast 13 to 60 grams, so definitely one of the wider cast ranges out of the bunch. I think in general, it hits the mark pretty well. So it casts the lighter 25 gram CB1 lure very, very nicely. It was certainly one of the longer distance casting rods on the test, and it went right through to that heavier 65 gram popper with ease. And there's just enough stiffness in the tip there to be able to work that 65 gram popper as well. It gives you a little bit of technical sort of feel to it, but without being super stiff. So it definitely has the ability to work more finesse baits quite nicely, but just takes in up to that 60-65 gram range. All right, moving on to the lifting test. So initially we've got that softer tip section, but it starts to stiffen up a little bit sooner than the lighter rods that we've already lifted with. So we get a bit more stiffness in the middle there to help with casting and hook sets, and then loads through towards the lower section between the stripper guide and the butt once you start to get that weight off the ground. So yeah, nice and comfortable, smooth, powerful rod. On this rod, we tested it with the larger 6000 Certate SW reel, and that balanced really nicely. So that 5,000 to 6,000 size in a saltwater style reel is, yeah, perfect match on this one. Okay, next up we have from FCL Labo the UCB-73 L. This rod has a stiffer tip compared to a lot of the other rods on test. It starts out a bit stiffer, and then the stiffness just continues through the blank as you get down to the butt. So it's quite a moderate taper, doesn't have obvious step-ups in the taper, but it is, yeah, medium taper, but stiffer all the way through. So the power comes on quickly, and carries more stiffness through to the tip. The specs of this rod, it's designed for casting, it says max 50 grams. In general, I'd say yes for absolute hard punching casts, that's about correct, but as we'll speak about later, we did cast a 60 gram on it without too much drama. It's rated on the rod as a P2, but I think for most people we would say it's a pretty solid P2 to 3 rod, so no dramas fishing P3 on there if you'd like to. Again, we've got top-notch Fuji components, titanium framed silicon and torzite guide mix, and we have double-footed guides all the way through to the tip. So double footers give you more stability when you're punching big leaders through the rod, but also makes it a little bit tip heavier when you're working the smaller lures. The reel on this rod, we went with the 6000 Certate SW, so that's a really nice match. That 5000, 6000 size reel, about spot on for it. Casting wise, going from the 25 gram CB1 Osma, it punched it really, really well. The benefit of the stiffer rod is that you can punch hard, flat, accurate casts really easily. So accuracy was great, and yeah, ability to cast across. At the time we had a bit of a crosswind, and it was quite nice for being able to punch straight across that wind accurately. Going through to the 40 gram CSP S110S, it did that really, really well. And also then moving on to the 65 gram CC popper, it's 15 grams above what it says the maximum is, but this rod still cast it without too much drama. And also being a stiffer rod, it was able to manipulate that popper quite well and give it a great action. So working the lures, the stiffer rod gives you a much better twitching action when you're wanting to manipulate and do more technical stuff. If you're fishing right at the lighter end of the range, the stiffness is going to perhaps take away from the finesse aspect of the rod. If you're working smaller vibes and small soft plastics and you want to get a nice feel as you're hopping and flicking them, then this rod is not going to give you quite as much feel. But it gives you a whole lot more as you get to the bigger end of the range for twitching and making stick baits dart and dive, or poppers bloop and splash really well. All right, moving on to the lifting test. See, with this rod, compared to the lighter rods we've done so far, this one has got a considerable step up in stiffness around the tip, and then the lifting power starts to come in around about that 1/3 the way down the rod, and plenty of power now right through till the butt. So stiffer lower section, and the stiffer section extends a bit further up the rod to give you really good hook sets and aggressive fish fighting power. Summing up on this one, it's stiffer rod, more aggressive, The stiffness in the middle, great for aggressive hook sets and fighting fish hard and aggressive, and also twitching lures more technical motions. And yeah, we'll talk more about that in the conclusion. Moving on, we go up to the Zenaq Fokeeto 73-3. So this rod has quite a different taper from its Longcast brothers. So the twitch range and the Longcast, they do sort of fit like a stepping stones, but certainly the way the taper and the way this rod is put together is a little different from the Longcast models. So the twitch rod is shorter than the others. It's at 7'3". It also has much more of a tip taper there. So it's got that softer tip initially, and then it steps up to more stiffness in that middle section and a whole lot more power in the butt. This rod is rated for P3 to 4, and certainly I'd say that's pretty much dead on, P3 to 4. I like fishing it with P3, but I know lots of people do run P4 on this rod. It's rated to cast 15 to 80 grams, which is quite a large range. But yeah, as we found out in the casting, it did handle it all pretty well. The specs on this rod, again, like all the Zenaqs, top of the line Fuji stuff, titanium frame silicon guides all the way through. We do have single foot guides again towards the tip, but we have quite large diameter single footers to allow big knots to pass through, but definitely that single footers allow for a bit more flexing of the tip and getting a bit more finesse up at the tip end. With the reel, we ran the 6000 size Certate SW on there, and that was pretty much the ideal match for it. Casting wise, it handled all the lures on test really well. So the 25 gram end of the range, it cast that Osma perfectly well, and as it suggests, it casts down to 15 grams. I don't think I'd have too much trouble casting lighter, although you might lose a bit of the feel of what's going on. Once you get below that 20 gram mark, you're probably not going to feel the rod loading as nicely. But certainly at 25 grams, cast beautifully, right through to the 65 gram. It handled that extremely well, but you could start to feel that 65 was getting up there towards the towards that upper end. So with a max range of 80 grams, I would say, yeah, at 80, it's going to cast it, but 65 is a pretty happy upper end for what it can do on an absolute full-blooded cast. Working the lures, it has nice sort of feel right down to the 25 gram end of the range. You're able to get a good feel of what the lure is doing in the water, and for minimum effort, you can get the lures darting and diving. When it moved on to say the CSP at the 40 gram end, again, it still had a nice mix of being able to feel it. Just gentle twitches would let the lure dart and dive very nicely. And then once we went through to the 65 gram popper, it certainly blooped it through the water well, but compared to say the stiffer rods like the FCLs, it didn't give it that really sharp action. So where you're gaining at the lighter end with finesse, especially if you were going to use soft plastics or vibes on this rod, that softer tip section there is going to give you a lot of great feel and a lot of ease of manipulation. It starts to wear off once you get up to the 65 gram end. Moving on to the lifting of the weights. With this twitch rod, you can see there's initially a much softer tip in that first, say, quarter of the rod. Then it starts to hit into a stiffer midsection, and then it gets stiffer and stiffer from there, loading through towards the first guide and into a powerful bottom end. So plenty of power there in the middle and bottom section. So to sum up this rod in short, is that it has sensitive tip, powerful middle, and really quite powerful bottom end. So certainly does do a great job of working more delicate lures where you want a lot of power, but due to its larger casting range, it will handle quite a wide variety of lures without too much dramas at all. So definitely at the heavy end of this range, this rod covers a whole lot of bases. Okay, the last rod for this test is the FCL Labo UCB-73 M. So starting from the tip, the taper, like the 73 L, it's stiffer from the get-go. So it shares a very similar moderate taper all the way through, and also shares the fact that it's stiffer all the way from tip to butt. But the M is just one step up in stiffness all the way through. So compared to a lot of the other rods on test where they have a faster taper at the tip, this one doesn't have such a extreme taper, but it definitely feels that stiffness from the get-go. That carries down to the middle. You've got quite a powerful middle section, so really good for twitching the heavier lures, and also really good for setting hooks on fish where you want to turn their head instantly and bring them towards the boat, down into a nice powerful bottom end that feels here on a par with the Zenaq 73 3, so similar sort of bottom end. Fitting wise, we've got the Fuji reel seat, all the titanium Torzite Fuji guides there, and yeah, best of the guides all the way through to the tip. We have double footers all the way up here, so extra strength and durability with heavy leaders, but also makes the rod a little bit stiffer. So for the purposes of what FCL's looking for, that stiffness is what they like. Reel wise, we went with the 6000 Certate SW again, so 6000 reel, perfect match on this. The rod is rated as a PE3, but I would call it PE3 to 4. So much like the Zenaq rod, 3 to 4 is a pretty happy place. I use it a lot with PE3, but many people would just go straight to the PE4 on this one. Casting wise, it's rated to cast up to 70 grams, and I would say, yeah, very comfortably 70 grams is at the comfortable top end for this rod. When we were casting it with the 25 grammer, it cast really, really well. So it absolutely punched it, but you don't have quite as much feel when you're manipulating the smaller lures. So the stiffness, which gives you that really good, hard, flat, accurate cast in all kinds of conditions. Also, when you're trying to manipulate the small lures, you don't get quite as much feedback through to the reel. So it does make it a little bit harder with delicate lures at the lighter end. Once we moved on to the 40 gram CSP at the S110S, it did a great job all round. So it was right in its happy casting range, and also for manipulating that lure, it worked it really, really well. When we went up to the 65 gram popper, it was definitely the best at working that popper by far. Maintained the stiffness so that you could just twitch without much effort at all. The popper would dart, chop, dive, do whatever you wanted. You got great manipulation out of it. And I would happily say, yeah, 65 grams, 70 grams, you can belt that kind of weight around on this lure all day long. You could probably squeeze it up to 80, 85 if you really wanted to, but I think, yeah, 70 is a pretty happy, comfortable max. Okay, moving on to the lifting on the FCL 73 M. Initially, we've got more tip stiffness than basically all the other rods on test. So it's, yeah, definitely got that stiffer section, which goes to about that first third there. Then it starts to really ramp up into the powerful bottom end, and definitely has the most lifting power through the middle of the rod compared to all the other rods on test. And yeah, definitely fishes that PE4 level very easily. So a quick summary of this rod is that it starts off reasonably stiff and just continues with more stiffness. So this rod is great for getting aggressive manipulation from lures, aggressive hook sets, and trying to turn fish and get them in the boat as quickly as possible. So certainly suits the active angler who's really wanting to put the power on the fish and land them fast. Okay, so to round all this up, we started out with the Zenaq 761 Longcast. That was definitely a sweet rod at the lighter end of the spectrum. It did a great job with all the smallest of lures, but it definitely struggled when you got towards the larger end of the lures. Power-wise, again, for the size of the rod, has a lot of power. It's going to be great for people who are targeting smaller pelagics like the spotty mackerel, queenfish, general smaller reef fish, snapper on plastics, but I think really the limitations are when you get into the bigger fish like longtail tuna, it's going to struggle a bit. Likewise, when we moved on to the Ocean Devil Kingslayer rod, that one had a similar kind of wide range of casting ability. In fact, probably had the widest range of cast ability out of all the rods, going from it'll do very small stuff down around that 10-12 gram mark and still can throw some larger weights up above the 45 gram mark. But because of the more parabolic action of the rod, the limitation is it doesn't give you as more technical twitchy retrieves as easily, but it is great for the finesse kind of presentations. Likewise, that rod had plenty of power to deal with all the smaller pelagics and reef fish, but it will struggle a bit once you get into the larger pelagic fish. Moving on from there, we went into the 782 Longcast from Zenaq. That one steps up a bit at the bottom end and also correspondingly has more room at the top end. This rod had a really nice ability to mix up. It's kind of in that, I guess you could say, the Goldilocks zone, not too light, not too heavy. It can still handle some of the lighter species, and it's got just enough to get into the longtail tuna end of the range. Being a bit stiffer, it was able to do a bit more technical actions on the lures, but it didn't quite get the heaviest end or the lightest end quite as well as some of the ones that sit on the extreme. So it's certainly a down the middle rod. From there, we went on to the FCL Labo UCB-73 L. This one was quite a step up in terms of the stiffness of rods. So moving on from the Longcast, it was a bit of a jump getting into that, the stiffness of the 73 L. That gives you much more ability with technical actions, twitching, popping, that kind of thing. But it does leave you a little bit less feel on the finesse side when you're using the smallest of lures and trying to do, the more finesse techniques. But when you hit that 73L level, the power has also correspondingly gone up. So you're sitting squarely in the range of rods that can really land a longtail tuna quickly. So definitely if you want to handle those larger reef flats fish and then some of the mid-sized pelagics and the longtail tunas for your inshore fishery, that's where the powerful rods really cut in for this test. Moving up from there, we went to the Zenaq Twitch 73-3, which has been a hugely popular rod, and for the obvious reasons it does have that slightly softer action on the tip, which gives you some nice finesse feel, but then it rapidly tapers up to a more powerful bottom end. So while it didn't respond quite as aggressively to hook sets as, say, the FCL rods does, it also had better finesse when it comes to dealing with, say, if you're using soft plastic lures or vibration baits, that slightly softer tip does give you the edge there. It also ramps up into a very powerful bottom end. So it's got more power than the 73 L in the FCL, but ever so slightly less power than the 73 M in the FCL. So it sits down the middle of the powerful bunch of rods in this range. It's a great rod for people who are looking for an all-rounder for targeting longtail tuna, bigger offshore snapper, and larger reef fish on the flats. Moving on from there, the UCB-73 M from FCL Labo. This rod was the powerhouse of the range. It had the stiffest tip and stiffest midsection and the most power in the butt. So in pretty much every category, it was either the stiffest or the most powerful. So it was great in terms of punching the heavier lures, really good for getting a twitchy technical action out of some of the lures and right through to the larger poppers. Where it lacks or has its limitations is definitely at the lighter end. Once you start getting below that 25 gram mark, you start to lose a fair bit of the feel of what's going on with the lure, and it's not going to be as good for finesse presentations where you want lighter weights and really get that good feel through the rod. But where it shines is stiffer rod, really aggressive hook sets, very good punching lures into the wind, and has the most power to land a big fish quickly. So ideal if you're trying to land large reef fish or tunas where there's going to be sharks around, and you have to just, whatever you do, you just got to get that fish into the boat as quickly as possible. Okay, if you liked what you've seen, feel free to follow us and check out a bunch of our other reviews. We've got videos on PE6, PE8 rods, how to choose a GT rod, and many more to come. Thanks very much for watching.